One of my New Year's resolutions this year is to try and prepare my homily earlier in the week so that everything isn't a mad rush on a Saturday afternoon, as you can imagine. So I got back from Costa del Maesteg on Wednesday night, and Thursday afternoon I thought, right, now I'm going to do my homily. So I sat down at my desk and something happened and I got distracted. So I thought, well, there we are then. So then Friday came and I thought, right, I'm going to sit down here and keep myself out of trouble and do my homily. And I think, Carol, I managed to put the title down. And then I got distracted by some naughty people down in the school. And then that was that. And sometimes, isn't it amazing how grace works? Because it wasn't until Saturday morning where I saw something on the BBC archives, if you like that sort of thing. I enjoy looking in the archives. And it was this letter. And it was almost like God was telling me to wait to see this letter. This letter here, beautifully modelled by myself, this letter here is a letter that was written to the BBC on the 8th of January 1952, 70 years ago. And this letter here, handwritten, as you can see, a snippet of, this letter here was a letter that Sir David Attenborough had written as a letter of application for a job with the BBC. And he was responding to an advert in the Times newspaper on that day. So he literally saw the advert and wrote a letter straight away for the post of Home Talks producer. And so it was received. And then you can see just at the top, my printer's cut it off, but you can see there the stamp of somebody in the BBC, somebody who enjoys a stamp. And that stamp there, which is dated the 13th of March 1952, even before my father was a twinkle in my grandfather's eye, had one simple word: rejected. And I thought to myself as I saw it, can you imagine anybody rejecting David Attenborough at all? I thought it was quite amazing, truthfully, that he'd been rejected from this post. For David Attenborough, that door was very much firmly closed. He was working at the time in the University of London Press, he says in his little letter, looking after new authors and dealing with new books. That job wasn't to be. That job came with a closed door. And of course, the great irony of it all was it's only 13 years later, where David Attenborough became the controller of BBC Two. Isn't it interesting how things work out? Isn't it interesting how things come around, that with the closing of one door, something else opens, something bigger and better, how things pan out. We cannot pass by today's feast of the baptism of the Lord without reflecting upon our own baptisms. We cannot pass by today without reflecting upon that moment which was captured in history, perhaps history a little while ago, perhaps a few gin and tonics ago, a few cooked dinners ago, a moment which is captured in history, a moment which probably, if I asked you to raise your hands, probably nearly all of us don't even remember that moment, the moment at the font. The only reason I remember mine is because I screamed the place down from the start of it to the finish, and I think that's when I got all the devil out, I think, in one foul swoop. Yet that moment, which was a historical event, captured in history, a moment which we don't remember, is the most important moment of our lives, the moment for our spiritual growth. Because from that moment, however long ago it may have taken place, God's grace has been revealed to us, we are told. And St. Paul goes on to say to Titus, and this has made salvation possible. These words from St. Paul are something hugely monumental, I think you'll agree. And yet, St. Paul speaks a little bit more, says a little bit more in that sentence, if you have a look in your newsletters. St. Paul says, all we have to do is to give up everything that does not lead to God and all our worldly ambitions. Easy peasy. I think not. Something else, hugely monumental task. And it demonstrates to us, this little snippet of that second reading, doesn't it? It demonstrates to us that our baptisms are not just this historical moment captured in time. Not just this moment in history, which we don't even remember, but that this moment in history continues to become into the present tense. It continues to be something which is so important for us, and something which, from what St. Paul says to Titus, something which demands so much more of us. At the moment of our baptism, we are offered the gift of friendship with God, and this friendship is something intimate. This friendship is something deeply personal. And of course, as we know, all of us, that the rest of our lives is made up of trying to make sense of this friendship, how this friendship looks to me, how it works itself out, how we grow in that friendship, that personal friendship with God. This is why we can say with confidence that the historical action of pouring water over the heads of our children, ourselves, is one thing. But the reality of living this out demands of us something different, something more. The reflection which St. Paul offers to Titus in that second reading is that passivity in our relationship with God is not enough. It's not enough to get baptized. Something else is needed. We need to participate. It's true that baptism brings with it incorporation into the body of Christ, brings with it grace, but living a life in conformity with this baptismal commitment is something else. When we approach the font for baptism, we are faced with a sequence of yeses and nos, which we are called to respond to. We reject some things and we make affirmations in other things. And when it comes to the no's, it's like David Attenborough's BBC letter of rejection all of those years ago. The door is closed. And with our baptisms, when we say no, when we say the no's, the rejections, the door is closed in that particular avenue. But as we know, David Attenborough's no leads to something greater, something better, eventually. And it's the same with us, isn't it? The friendship with God may all about being saying no to one thing, but it's about making that strong yes in something else, something greater. And it is this yes which will encourage us and sustain that friendship with God, not made once, but made continually, when we continually respond generously to the Lord's invitation. And this is why our parents and our godparents on our behalf stand up and make a public statement. They make a public declaration of faith, rejecting Satan and all his empty promises. With that action, they plant within us the seed of faith. They participate in our journey of faith and growth. Each of us then in our turn is called to take that on board from a young age all the way up to our dotage. are called to play our own part and to make faith our own, that relationship with God our own. But we do this together. We do this side by side, walking together. That journey to Emmaus, isn't it? We are walking along that path together. The decision to baptize a child, or the decision to offer yourself for baptism, brings with it that decisive no, brings with it the closing of the door, as in they use the David Attenborough analogy. And the choice to do all that we can to give up everything that does not lead to God. A task, of course, as we all know, which takes our whole lives. That's why we continually come back to it time and again in the sacrament of reconciliation. Yet with that no comes a yes, which gives meaning and purpose to our lives, to our very beings, to the core of who we are. I'd like to conclude with some words of Pope Benedict, who's far more poetic than me. He was speaking a few years ago to parents and godparents of babies who were about to be baptized by him. The Pope says, "It is a yes to the challenge of really living life, of saying no to the attack of death that presents itself under the guise of life. And it is a yes to the great gift of true life that became present on the face of Christ, who gives himself to us in baptism and subsequently in the Eucharist." As we begin our new years, as we make our resolutions, let us live out our baptismal vocation. Let us make that decisive yes to walk together, to build up the body of Christ on earth. Amen.